The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm going to give just another minute or two for late arrivals to enter the webinar, and then I will begin. Speak to you shortly. Okay, well, thank you for joining us today, everyone. What we'll be talking about today is around optimization, A/B testing, and experimentation, and looking at the practices and processes that will mean that your organization can really take your optimization practice to the next level and deliver the maximum possible results to your organization. So my name is Douglas Morris. I'm the Director of Optimization at a digital agency called Ratio here in the UK. And we're working with companies in retail, financial services, and other sectors to maximize how much revenue they're getting from their website and other digital properties, and that's what we'll be talking about today. So the three categories really that I want to talk to you about today are firstly, not just looking at each test in isolation as to how good or bad your idea was, but also looking at your optimization program as a whole and how you can really measure, monitor, and tweak the metrics that will be leading indicators of your success. I want to look at the role of process and methodology in optimization. Oftentimes people think that winning an optimization is all about the creativity of your ideas, etc. But actually having well-refined processes and a robust methodology behind what and how you're testing can be just as instrumental in the level of success you get. And finally, I want to talk about the types of research that are actually going to deliver you the best experiment hypotheses and will build up to the best possible strategy. Because often we speak to organizations where their testing plan is driven by the opinions of people internally as to where the pain points are on the website for your customers or where the biggest opportunities lie. But actually, there's a fair bit that you can do as far as as research that will deliver you better hypotheses that are going to be more likely to win and more likely to deliver you a good outcome if they do win. So, yeah, I guess what we love to talk about in optimization are the wins that we get, and that is increases in the primary success metric of any given experiment. So it's always fantastic to go back to the organization and talk about, that you got a 20% lift to conversion rate or that customer satisfaction or repeat purchase increased, because those are tangible outcomes as far as the success of that individual experiment. But the question to ask yourself is whether have any of that data actually helps you understand how you can drive more success from your optimization program overall. They do tell you to some extent whether you were doing well or poorly, that is, whether you managed to get a win against your success metric, but they don't really tell you where you're going wrong or what levers you can pull in order to drive more success from the program as a whole. And so when we're looking at taking our experimentation program to the next level and not just saying we want to run some A/B tests sporadically now and then, but we really want to take this seriously and maximize how much we can deliver from this program. We need metrics that measure the entirety of the optimization program, not just any one individual experiment. And we're not even talking, although you could say that one of those metrics could be collectively what all the tests delivered in terms of conversion rate increase or average order value and so on. We're talking about other metrics, which I'll go into now. So the first one that I want to talk about is test capacity. So one of the limitations that you'll have as far as how many A/B tests you can run is simply put, like how many journeys you can test on your website and how many and how long those tests are going to take to get a result because of the traffic volume that are going through those journeys. And test capacity basically helps us understand, like, are we maximizing on those opportunities that we have to experiment, or do we have journeys that we're leaving untested? So, I mean, essentially, there's a calculation here which is to look at the average test duration in the number of weeks and divide that into 52, being an annual year, and that will tell you an annual being a year worth of weeks, and that will tell you how many tests you could run across your entire website if it was the case that you had just one journey to test. But then obviously you have multiple journeys that you can test. You might have a product page as well as a home page, checkout, etc. And so what we want to understand then is not just how many tests we can run across the entire year, but how many across multiple different funnels or pages. So for example, if we had an average test duration of 5 weeks and we have 5 simultaneously testable funnels or pages, then we have an annual capacity of 52 tests. Now, if it was the case that we only ran 4 tests over the course of the year, or maybe 5 tests to make the math a bit easier, then you could say that you're actually only achieving about 10% of the possible experimentation capacity on your website. And self-evidently, that means that you've got headroom to improve against. I mean, if you had a page on your website that only converted at 10%, then you would be looking at that as an opportunity to improve things, and such is the case with test capacity as well. The second metric I want to talk about is test velocity. So where test capacity is talking about how many tests you could run, test velocity is, sorry, I've just got someone here who's saying that their speaker's been muted by the organizer. So I'm just going to see if I can address that. Can you hear me now? Okay, I think that's fixed. So I'm very sorry about that. Not sure what happened there. Okay, so test velocity is a measure of how many tests you are actually running. So experiment capacity is how many you can run. Velocity is how many are running. Essentially, we want to be increasing our velocity on a month-on-month basis, because that means that we are getting more experiments out there. And all else equal, if you are running more experiments, then you're getting more learnings for one, and obviously you'll be getting more wins as well. Sorry, just 1 second. Okay, so yeah, essentially you should track on a month-by-month basis how many experiments you've actually run, and then hopefully you see a positive trend, and you'll know that you're making a better effort against your test capacity. You could put it on a chart along with your actual test capacity, and in that way you could see, like in this chart, how close we are to actually coming up against that. A very bad thing is if we have no tests running on our website for a period of time, that we want to avoid at all costs. So I suggest that you have a 0 test tracker, and that everyone who's involved in experimentation is making sure to try and keep that at 0. And this essentially is how many days has it been since you had the last how many days has it been since you had the last 0 experiments day? That is a day when you had no experiments live on your website. And sorry, rather than keeping that at 0, you'd want to build up a consecutive streak and try and always be testing, essentially, because if you're not, then you're losing opportunities, revenue, etc. Obviously, we also want to measure some sort of success as far as our win rate, because ideally we should be improving the quality and execution of our test hypotheses. Some organizations take it even further and don't say a win rate necessarily, but a learning rate or an insight rate, being the combination of the percentage of tests that won and also the percentage of tests that delivered some learning that could be used to iterate at a later date. Because keeping in mind that a learning is also quite a good outcome to get from an experiment, even if you don't win that time. So try and keep your finger on the pulse over time of how successful your tests are. And again, ideally, you'll see that start to increase over time. And if not, then you can ask questions internally about, well, do we need to invest more time and money in research? Or is it our execution that's going awry? Or, how can we improve things? Another great one is regarding the number of variations you're running per experiment. So this is some pretty fascinating Optimizely research around variations and their impact on your likelihood to succeed. So obviously they've got a lot of data about what people are doing insofar as experimentation. And they went back and said, well, let's split up all the experiments that have been run on our platform by the number of variations that they included. And let's look at the rate at which those tests won or experiments won, being this green number just here. And we can see that for experiments that only included 2 variations, which I can tell you would be the majority of them, only 1/4 of those experiments actually won. However, for experiments that included 5 variations, the win rate was 75% higher. And all of a sudden, almost half of tests winning for those organizations running 5 variations. Now, that is the other quite interesting takeaway here is the fact that you need to recognize that nobody is running tests that win every time in optimization or experimentation. It's okay to have losses, provided that you can take something away from that, which is something else I'll talk about shortly. So you should keep track of the number of variations you're managing to run per experiment. You should try and make those variations as distinct from each other as possible, although that's something that perhaps you can't measure quantitatively, because the more distinct your variations are as far as the different ways in which you execute upon a hypothesis, then the more likely you'll be to influence some positive result. So the next thing I want to talk about is the process and methodology that you should put around optimization. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's can be a perception that A/B testing is all about creativity and not about process and methodology, or the process and methodology kind of stifle innovation. But actually, in my opinion, process and methodology is what is going to make your experimentation program as efficient as possible. And obviously, the more efficient you are, the more output you can deliver from what are going to be finite resources. So if it's only you sitting there trying to A/B test on your website, which is the case for a lot of organizations, then you've got to work out how you can maximize what you're delivering from the time that you're investing. And that means looking at the processes that you put around your optimization program. So one thing that we do at Ratio is for all new customers that we're working with, we put together an experimentation charter. And what this does is to lay out in explicit detail prior to even looking at the research that we're doing to support the hypotheses, who is going to be involved at each step of the way, what are their roles and responsibilities, what does the process look like from the time that you come up with an idea to the time that it goes live, and then that you the test finishes up and you analyze the results, and which stakeholders are involved at each step, and what are they committing to as far as a service level agreement. So you don't want to be in a situation where everything's kind of unstructured and you're having to go and find out who can help you with a particular element of the testing program when you're already going. You want to define all this stuff up front. You want to have visibility and make sure that everyone who's a stakeholder in the program understands what you're doing and why. And that's what you put in an experimentation charter. If you Google Optimise experimentation charter, they've got a great template that you can use and distribute within your organization. I would also suggest strongly that you use a centralized project management tool to manage this. So everyone who's involved in the process needs visibility over the workflow. They need to understand that if I am the front-end developer and I'm waiting on the designer to complete designs before I start my work, then being able to see that the most recent experiment has moved to the designers column gives me a heads up that work is coming for me. So you build out a workflow in your project management tool, which could be just Trello, or it could be Jira, Monday, or some other more advanced tool, and make sure that matches the process agreed in your optimization charter. What you really don't want to be doing is setting live experiments that aren't necessarily bad ideas, but they're poorly executed because there's bugs or other errors that mean you can't collect data correctly, or the users can't interact with things in the way you intended. So we would strongly suggest that you build a QA checklist, and the QA checklist should go through all of the steps that are relevant and required to make sure that you can have 100% confidence that what you're setting live is going to work as expected. The beauty of a checklist is that when you follow it, there's absolutely no room for forgetting a step. So make whoever is QAing these tests, even if it's yourself, complete this QA checklist, and you'll know that you're always going to have checked the key browsers or device types on your website. You're always going to have the tracking working. You're always going to be pointing new links to working pages as opposed to broken ones when you follow them, etc. You should have some kind of knowledge repository as far as what worked in the past, because you will, as I mentioned, learn a lot from the experiments that failed and that won, that will help you iterate further in the future. And as more people join the organization or join the experimentation team, they're not going to have the benefit of having actually been through the process of having launched the previous experiments. So you should have a common set of factors that you evaluate an experiment on once it went live, ones that can inform someone new to the team without too much additional hassle or analysis what it was that you actually learned from having done the test. So, I mean, hopefully most of you are actually completing some meaningful analysis of what the outcomes were from a test that won or lost, not just accepting the result, but take it to the next step and record it in a way that you can meaningfully communicate it with the rest of your organization. Qualitative research is another one. So we are massive on user research and other sorts of qualitative data at Ratio. And this is another process that you can improve over time, because you will find that there are specific ways of going about doing things that will be more or less successful. So for argument's sake, you might find that each time you run a free text input field on a Qualitative or Hotjar survey, that the response rate is very poor at only 0.25%. You may find instead that offering free text as an option, but providing other easier options for users to click on first, will mean that you get a response rate 4 times as high. So try and standardize the way that you're collecting that information, because it will mean that you get more of it, and you can over time work out and refine what questions it is that you should be asking to get the best possible data, both in terms of the quality of the response and the volume of them from the users that you're surveying. Now I want to talk a little bit about, well, quite a bit actually, about research and strategy. So it's really, really important that you have a solid grasp of this stuff in order to make sure that you're launching tests that have a high chance of succeeding. What we encounter a lot when we're talking to organizations that are just starting out on their A/B testing journey is that there's a tendency to focus on tests like the color of buttons. It's probably a classic example of an A/B test that almost everyone tries when they first start in experimentation. The thing I would encourage you to keep in mind is that you want your optimization program in any given test that you launch to have a meaningful result. you want to make a meaningful impact to the percentage of users that are converting, or the percentage of users that are completing a particular funnel step, or signing up to your email form, or whatever it is. Now, it's just not it's simply not reasonable to expect. Well, I take it back a step actually. In order to influence that meaningful change in result, you need to be making a meaningful change to the user's behavior, which means that you need to be making a meaningful change to their experience, their perception of you as an organization, etc. And that means moving beyond testing the colors of buttons and smaller things like that, and actually really trying to get to grips with what are the barriers in terms of usability on your website that are preventing people from converting. And similarly, what are their needs, problems, etc., and where are the gaps in terms of how you're communicating your unique selling points or your proposition based on what they're actually after. And having a solid research strategy as far as trying to uncover those things is going to be the grounding for developing good hypotheses that actually are likely to win and get you great results. So the best test hypotheses will have a grounding in both the qualitative and the quantitative. I really cannot overstate enough that you need a combination of both of those two things in order to come up with a good idea that's worth executing upon. It is, of course, a great thing if you move from trusting the assumptions or decision-making of people internally with no data to even just using one or the other. But that is quantitative or qualitative. But it is truly going to be to your detriment if you are not looking at ways to combine that information in order to find the biggest opportunities. So the way I like to look at it is that digital analytics data is going to tell you what's happening. So you understand that mobile users on mobile devices are failing to move on from the product page to the checkout or the cart. But it's only qualitative data that is talking to users or looking at what they're actually doing on the page that's going to tell you why that happened. If you're just using digital analytics data, then you're filling in the gaps with your own assumptions about what the problems are. And if you're just using qualitative data, then you're not necessarily going to be focusing on the biggest issues because you can't meaningfully prioritize the things that you want to do without putting some numbers behind it in terms of a business case. So one thing I wanted to talk about was the formatting's a bit gone a bit awry here, sorry, but I wanted to talk about what we have done along these lines for a large B2B financial services organization. So what we did is use a platform called whatusersdo.com. There are a couple, and that allowed us to recruit users who would basically answer a series of questions for us, follow a journey within their internet browser, and talk to us about what their experience was like along the way. So we got them to follow the complete journey for a product, let's say like a current account product or a credit card, from awareness, that is like tell us how you would go about finding providers for this product, through to consideration and decision, that is find the right product on our website and look at the elements of it that are attractive or not attractive, and then make a decision as to whether it's suitable for you. And we also got them to do that against competing providers so that we could try and understand what were the weak or strong points of our experience relative to the other financial services organizations that were considered to be competitors. Obviously, we prioritized strategically important products. The next thing that we did, once we came up with a bunch of issues that people had experienced, because keeping in mind when you're doing this, you're going to be having a sample size of like 5 or 10 users, unless you invest quite a bit of money. So that's like £60 per video. So the next thing we wanted to do was actually try and validate this using analytics data. So if it is the case that 4 out of 10 users entered on the homepage and couldn't understand how to interact with the component or find the signpost for a particular product, how can we actually validate that with Adobe Analytics in this case as to what other users are having, what percentage of other users are having that issue? So if, for argument's sake, there was a component on the homepage that that you could open up like a tabs or accordion menu, and it revealed some links. And users were reporting that they didn't realize that you could open it. Well, we looked in Adobe Analytics and said, what percentage of users actually successfully open that component? If it was the case that they said that they didn't understand that the links within related to their needs, we looked at what percentage of users who interacted with that component successfully clicked a link, and so on. So that's when I'm talking about the business cases, to understand whether it's a problem just for this one user that you are talking to, or whether it's a problem for users overall. You can even then use products like Hitwise or Nacho Analytics to do the same thing, that is that quantifying against competitor journeys. And basically use this to kind of understand where the biggest issues are and then prioritize which ones you actually need to go about fixing. Because the barriers that are affecting 90 out of 100 users are much more important than the barriers that are affecting 10 out of 100 users. I think you get the picture. So I wanted to then just go through a super quick example as to how this might play out for another financial services firm. So we have this company, Aberdeen Asset Management, and we might have recruited a user and said, go through the journey of trying to find a ISA product for yourself. The user might say that they rely upon word of mouth recommendations to make these sorts of decisions, and a friend might have told them that Aberdeen Asset Management was a good company to invest with. So their journey might start by simply searching for Aberdeen Asset Management. Now, hopefully, if you're in retail, you'd already have a strong grasp of who is advertising on your branded search terms. But in this case, we found that there were actually competing providers that were advertising on the Aberdeen Asset Management keywords. And we need to take that into account, both in terms of should we take some action insofar as running our own PPC ads there, and or should we, well, just in general, that's interesting information to have about how the user's journey is starting. They could have come to the homepage. Keeping in mind this is a hypothetical scenario. It's not actually literally Aberdeen that we're working with, but they might have not understood that the terminology private investors was meant for them being a retail investor, and expressed verbal confusion around that. But we might find through Google Analytics that only 10% of users who land on this homepage don't make a selection of one of those four elements. So while you could say that, yes, that is a problem, is private investors clear enough to users who are searching for this product? It's not a big enough problem to prioritize to try and fix it. They might have followed the journey through to the private area and found that from the homepage of the private area, they were able to quite easily locate the ISA section. And perhaps they'll find that 80% of ISA content visits start on this page. You might follow the journey even further. In this case, there's a page within that ISA section called What is a Stocks and Shares ISA? And it has a bunch of different links around what you'd expect, which is like, what is even an ISA? Why should I care? How does it differ from a cash ISA? How can I invest in it, etc.? And you might find that 70% of visits following this journey next go to getting started with Stocks and Shares ISA, because that is kind of the natural journey that you would expect users to follow, being that you first find out about what it is and then you try and get started with it. And then finally, on that getting started with Stocks and Shares ISA, the user who's you're doing the usability study with might be a bit confused, because despite the fact that they've gone to a page called Getting Started with Stocks and Shares ISA, there's not actually a call to action on this page that's telling them to take the product and get started. And you might find that analytics data shows that users only convert from this page, having followed that journey, at a rate of 5%. In actual fact, when we looked more closely at this journey, the call to actions relating to actually taking the product were at the bottom of the About page, as opposed to the Get Started page. That is, they were on the page that describes what an ISA is, not on the page that says Get Started with it. So that is like just one way in which combining usability study with analytics can kind of help you identify where there are problems, and then also business case whether those are worth fixing. So some different ways that you can use voice of customer type of tools, or it's would be, for example, you can use this concept of user testing. Maybe you can build a prototype in InVision. It's like an online wireframing tool, and test that on users within your organization before you actually build it out as a fully fledged test and put it into production or launch an A/B test with your testing tool. I would strongly encourage you to talk to sales and customer service staff within your organization. They will be an absolute goldmine of problems that users are identifying, and I bet they'll love to tell you about them too, with the user experience on your website. But they'll also be able to tell you what the common customer objections are and how sales staff would go about overcoming them, because that is actually going to help you refine how you position your unique selling points to users on your website. If you know that something is already working well in some other channel, i.e. sales, don't reinvent the wheel. Perhaps just copy the sort of stuff that they're doing. You can run surveys, whether it's via email or on-site, like I said, the Qualitative or Hotjar survey. You should be asking why people came to the website in the first place, and if they didn't buy, what were the reasons for that? You should also ask what they really like about your brand or your organization or the product, so that you can use those points in how you're communicating about the product to other users. A really fantastic one is to put a survey on your thank you page of your checkout and ask if there were any issues that almost stopped that purchaser from buying, because undoubtedly there will be people who were very close to dropping out of the process but managed to push through and buy anyway. Whereas sometimes the danger of asking questions of people earlier in the funnel, i.e. before they've actually purchased, is that you could be getting data from users that never intended on buying or weren't even close to buying in the first place. So asking users that just purchased what barriers, if any, there might have been that almost stopped them from buying is making sure that they're kind of qualified to give you that information. You can use visitor replay technology to see the specific challenges that users are having, how they're interacting in real time, and heat and scroll maps can help you understand what information is important to users. That is, what are all their mouse cursors hover over? Or conversely, is there stuff within the page that we think will be quite important to conversion, but is not being seen due to the position on the page? I just want to give one quick cautionary tale about how not to approach optimization and the danger of hippos being highest paid person's opinion. That's a hippo. I used to work some years ago at a retail organization in Australia who sold vouchers for different activities. So a pretty cool company to work for. And they had a navigation menu that had been around for some years, maybe since a rebuild 2 or 3 years ago, and they'd not done much in the way of testing on the navigation menu. And when you get people that high up in the organization who see things that have become, quote unquote, a bit dated, they start to express their opinion that it's something that should change. So we had the CEO saying, hey, this navigation menu must be our priority. I think it's a big opportunity. The head of marketing was saying that it's not really reflective of our brand personality, and the head of product was saying that it doesn't actually surface all of our categories. So, hey, the development team and the design team went away and tried to create a better experience. So we did 2 months of design and development in order to create this, and that is, I am sure for all of you, there's a massive scarcity of development resources, and so it's really important that when you do these sorts of experiments that you are putting your absolute best foot forward, especially if it's going to take this amount of time. And we came up with this really neat experience that was kind of a mega menu. That is, that you clicked on things to reveal additional categories, and we had a photo to help people visualize the experience, and maybe a bit of text as well as a link. And hey, we were so happy that it looked really good. But the test lost, and we had no idea why, just assumptions about why it lost. And if we followed on any of those assumptions, then we'd be looking at another 2 months potentially to build a new iteration, and no more certainty that the new idea would be any better than the old one. So I just want to talk about the reasons that was the case. So, or some of the problems with our approach. So I think the first thing is that we didn't actually have a hypothesis. we hadn't done user testing. We hadn't really dug into the analytics. We hadn't talked to customer service staff to see whether the navigation menu was an issue that users were reporting an issue with. And so, in fact, we didn't have a specific hypothesis as to what the change we expected, what change we expected to influence by virtue of the changes that we were making. We were just kind of trusting the opinion of the highest paid people in the organization, and that's a problem because marketers are not customers, and marketers should not assume that they know what the problems are that customers are having. Had we had a data-driven hypothesis, maybe things would have turned out a bit differently. So yeah, I guess like as I've already kind of been saying, if you have a good test hypotheses, it should be setting out to do things like solving actual problems that users are reporting, like they can't find pricing, or they can't see how to buy it, the call to actions aren't clear, they don't know what the sizing means, or highlighting or clarifying your value proposition, reducing anxiety, introducing urgency, etc. Our experiment did none of those things. It was just that we wanted something that looked a bit prettier. And at a minimum, had we not created a test that did any of these things, we should have at least put some metrics in place that helped us understand how the existing navigation menu was performing to tell even if there was any headroom to improve how it was performing. For example, we could have said, all right, of everyone that opens the navigation menu, what percentage of users find a link to click on? And that would have told us to what extent, or would have been an indication of to what extent there's confusion from users with what was presented there. If it was the case that 90% of users opening that navigation menu found something to click on, then we would know that that is not really an opportunity because there's no headroom to improve against. But if it was 10% that clicked on something having opened it, that would be a different story. So we didn't quantify the opportunity or prioritize that hypotheses against anything else. And yeah, I guess that's another learning, which is that when you have an experiment, you need to try and prioritize it ruthlessly. So you should have a list of hypotheses, not just one, and you should be asking these sorts of questions and using that to prioritize the experiment. These are questions that we've developed after a lot of trial and error, but it could be as simple as having 3 criteria that you're prioritizing experiments on, being how much effort is it going to be to implement, how much impact is it going to have in terms of an uplift, and what's the priority in terms of the size or number of visitors moving through that journey relative to the rest of your website. And making sure that you're at least even doing that, if not trying to be a bit more sophisticated in how you prioritize what you work on, will minimize those opportunity costs and make sure that you're testing the best possible hypotheses. Finally, we had no way of validating what behavior was occurring with the new navigation. So after the test failed, we just kind of had to use our own intuition as to why users didn't like it. We should have added that tracking to the navigation menu to understand exactly what users were clicking on, what they were interacting with, etc., so that we could really drill down into the customer journey when the test lost. So make sure that you think about what tracking you need, and you need to put that in place before the test goes live. So I guess just a few quick takeaways, because I have gone a bit over time, thanks for listening, would be that you should be using digital analytics data to try and understand where the biggest problems are. And you can also use it a little bit to try and understand the drivers of the dropout by looking at interactions that are happening within the page. But really, in terms of identifying objections, pain points, problems, you can't go past the qualitative data. So yeah, everything I said before around using customer research to find objections, to find things that work well in terms of overcoming those, to find out what customers view your value proposition to be, etc. Make sure that you're using both of those things to develop your hypotheses and prioritize it, and make sure that you've got tracking in place so that you actually know why your experiment won or lost. And that is everything today. So if you have any questions, feel free to send them through. It doesn't appear that we've got any more since the start of the webinar. Okay, Well, thank you very much for listening. My email address is there, douglas.morris@ratiopartners.co.uk. If you wanted to reach out, if you wanted to have a chat about testing, analytics, user research, I love talking about it all. Or to talk about some of the problems or opportunities that you see in your organization, please feel free to touch base. And thank you very much for listening today.